Buongiorno a tutti. My name is Mary and I am a doctoral student here in Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard. And I have the pleasure of being here today with Giuliano Milani to talk about your book, Vite Nuove, which was written in 2021 with Elisa Brilli, first in French, then in Italian, and with an incoming translation in English. So thank you so much, Giuliano, for being here with us.
Thank you, Marie.
So, Ambrogio Pistoia, who is our professor here in Italian, talks about you as a historian of archival records and of Elisa Brilli as a historian of literary text and medieval culture. So when would you say that your intellectual and your textual encounter has become most generative?
Well, yes, I consider myself an historian of archival record because I was trained in the analysis of medieval archival records. I made my dissertation thesis on political exclusion in Italian city communes. And when I published it, my professor remarked the fact that I never mentioned the most famous of the politically excluded men of medieval Italy, namely Dante. After some years, I decided to include him in the analysis. And I started to look at the record of his banishment in comparison with the records I already knew that concerned other less known people. And some similarities appear that were interesting for Dante scholars. For example, Dante scholars have considered that the main evidence against Dante, who was banished for corruption, was only a rumor, because the word used by the document was fama in Latin. But in fact, fama was used in every document of this kind. And so it wasn't exactly an argument for saying that, for that reason, Dante's condemnation were unjust. So I decided to compare also other kind of records concerning Dante. With another colleagues, Antonio Montefusco, we organized some workshop in which we invited speakers, experts of certain kinds of documents, to read again the documents concerning Dante. For example, an expert of wedding contract documents to read the wedding contract of Dante. And it was an interesting research experience. Everybody was happy to exchange information. In the meanwhile, also Elisa Brilli were doing something similar. She were comparing the stories Dante had wrote about himself with other models. And so we decided to write together a life of Dante, and that's how that book has begun.
And I remember you described your book as an experiment. So is it the first time that comes to your mind when you think about this writing process with Elisa Brilli?
Yes, because we try to give ourselves some rules and to respect them, the rules, in order to analyze the data we had. In the case of the life of Dante, the data were the records. The different records that were of two kinds. On one side, the archival records. On the other side, all the stories Dante have tells about himself, about his life. The first rule we decided to apply has been to analyze separately these two kinds of records. And to compare, as we have done in other stuff I was telling you before. And so, for example, compare all the other contracts of wedding to the contracts of wedding on Dante. We discovered something in this way, and the other rule we decided to apply was the fact of not combining the two series of sources, not try to fill the void that one series had left with the other series. We decided also more generally to don't be afraid of emptiness. Sometimes emptiness in the existing record is a fact that can be useful to explain things. The fact, for example, that Dante is not present in archival records of certain city can mean that he didn't have a special role in that city and so on. So that's the way, that's the reason we call it an experiment.
Okay. And when going through all these archival records, have you been surprised? And if you have been surprised, what would you say that these surprises tell us about the art of writing history?
Yes. Sometimes I've been surprised. Sometimes I've been surprised because I didn't know the kind of document of the series that a specific document belonged. For example, I've been surprised when an expert of debt, which is called Franex Nura, told me that the fact that we had some records in which appeared that Dante had borrowed money didn't mean that he was poor. Conversely, it could mean the fact that people considered him economically solid. That was a kind of surprise. In other situation, I was surprised because some operation made me understand something, some exercise in historical analysis. For example, I decided to try to understand how, what kind of people were the people with whom Dante exchanged poems. In the Florence of Dante, there was this social practice of exchanging poems. There were someone who sent his poem as a letter, and the other sent their answers back, other poems as answers. Well, I tried to understand who were, from a social point of view, the correspondents of Dante. And I discovered that they were socially homogeneous. There were sometimes notaries or merchants. They belonged to what at the time were called the major guilds. And more surprisingly, that has been a real surprise, they were all living in the same neighborhood as Dante. And this little discovery has pushed me to try to see where were the houses of all the Florentines mentioned in the Commedia. And there I discovered that most of them, a good percentage of them, they were living in the same neighborhood. So it was a real surprise to understand that in the most universal work of medieval culture, the Commedia, in fact, the material, the base, was taken from a very little and narrow space.
That's very interesting. And continuing on that, I had the feeling reading your book that you described Dante as a transgressive figure and a revolutionary figure in some senses, and particularly because although he was very prolific and stylistically innovative from his very early sonnets, he didn't have a profession, and you insist a lot on that point. So do you think I am correct of thinking that this is the cornerstone of your book? And how did it change your understanding of the life of Dante, of the poetry of Dante?
Yes, it's one of the things we have understood in writing and in making research for this book. In fact, it was on another level the same experiment I mentioned before. Use, if you want, the older people, in this case, the older poets of the time of Dante, as the norm, the invariant variable, and Dante as the variant one. And if you adapt this kind of method, you can discover on one side that all the other poets of the time, they have a job. As I was telling before, they were notaries, they were merchants, sometimes they were knights who possessed lots of land. Sometimes they were also judges or jurists. Well, Dante is formed for this kind of profession. He has studied Latin as a notary. He has studied maybe a bit of theology like a friar or a preacher, but he didn't have a real profession. And he was not that rich to be a real knight, as, for example, his good friend, first friend, as he said, Guido Cavalcanti. On the other side, if you compare all these people to Dante, you discover that Dante writes more poems than the others when he is young. In the sense that we have lots more of poems by Dante than of other people. And so you can, we started to make together all this assumption and say, maybe it's because that he hadn't a job that he wrote so many poems. Maybe he made of a social activity that was important at the time, the writing of poems, to show the capacity of playing and to use the writing and language. He made, I was saying, it made of this side activity the principal activity. And this was something that we consider important, something to reflect on.
Yeah, actually, going through these chapters, like, I read them as this impassioned investigation of the practice of writing in Dante, and almost a praxis, like a transformative activity. And what strikes me is that it is not only transformative for Dante, for his own poetic personality, but also for his ideal community, his readership. And you write also for his relations with others. So how do you think this performative reading of Dante's life can change the way we think about his texts?
Well, it is a part that has been written in the book by Elisa Brilli, but I can say something about it. I can say how I understood the first time this idea of performative poetry. In one of the workshops we organized about the letters of Dante, Elisa Brilli considered one of the letters of Dante. That letter he wrote to the Emperor Henry VII, who were coming to Italy. In this letter, Dante put something that is very important in medieval letter, the salutatio, the salutation, the first part of the letter in which you name the sender and the recipient of the letter. And as a sender, he named himself Dante Alighieri from Florence, undeserved exiled, as he signed the letter. But he also added, and all the Tuscan who desire peace. Well, a lot of researchers, a lot of Dante scholars have tried to identify these Tuscans who were looking for peace. And they identify as existing group, like the White Guelph Party or the people who were supporting some lords in the Tuscany. Elisa Brilli proposed conversely that there was no existing group behind this name, this sentence, this indication. Maybe Dante wanted to create a group by writing this letter and by giving this indication. And in this way, if you apply the same idea to other works of Dante, you can discover that maybe he imagined some possible communities of readers, an audience which didn't exist, which was created by his works. That can explain also how some works which belong to an unexisting genre, like the New Life, the Vite Nuove, can be possible, and also maybe the Commedia.
I love that it shows how collaborative your work with Elisa Brilli has been, and how innovative it has been too. And in particular, you introduce a concept, a new instrument in one of your chapters, which is a testament. And I read it as an endeavor for you to free yourself from a distinction between monuments and documents, introduced by Erwin Panofsky, and talking about testament instead, as you write, an act written in the first person in any state of consciousness and will, and that can be updated. And since, as you explain further, Dante transformed his narratives of his self through the years, how would you say that he updated his biographies? And why did you choose to use this term of testament?
We decided to use this idea of testament because we found that there was two visions of the Commedia, two interpretations of the Commedia that were mutually exclusive. The one we called the monument, a monumental reading of the Commedia, according to this interpretation, the Commedia is a sort of cathedral that Dante created, controlling every aspect. Any of the part of the Commedia get out from the control of Dante as an immense architect that want to celebrate himself and God and the world God created. More recently, other scholars have insisted on another kind of reading of interpretation that we called documentary. According to this interpretation, the Commedia, in the Commedia there is something which get out the control from Dante. Like the document reveals something else, the Commedia sometimes reveal some thing that Dante wanted to hide, some ancient change of political opinion, supporters, and so on. These two interpretations, as I was saying, are mutually exclusive. Either Dante controls everything, either Dante lets something get out of his control. This idea of testament, it's important to keep them together. In the sense that a testament is something that someone want to write to as they said in medieval, save his soul and reproduce something himself, and at the same time something that can be updated. In this sense, the Commedia is something that Dante wanted to let to the other people, as other people wanted to let some money or holdings or land. He didn't have lots of money holding land, and so he let lots of knowledge. And in this sense, the Commedia is something that is linked to other works of Dante. Also in the Banquet, the Convivio, Dante explained that he wanted to be a passeur, someone who take the bread of the knowledge from the table of the wise and to give to the people, and so to pass by. And at the same time, the idea of testament can allow to think that Dante, during the long years of the writing of Commedia, have sometimes changed his mind about something, and so he has decided to update that text.
Okay. Thank you, Giuliano, and this will be my last question. What is your favorite part of La Commedia? Is it Inferno or Purgatorio, Paradiso? Or do you have a favorite poem of Dante? And how did you encounter this poem?
It's a difficult question, but I think that now, at the moment, because it has changed during the time, at the moment my favorite part is the Purgatorio, that long walks in a mountain that Dante makes, and that is at the same time a moment of rest from Inferno, but also a moment in which Dante rethink more in a more relaxed way, maybe not always to what he have seen, what he has lived, and I like this atmosphere from the very beginning of the Purgatorio.
Okay. Thank you, Giuliano, and maybe the Purgatorio is also a good metaphor for our lives as PhD students.
Not only.
Thank you for being with us.